Okay, so thanks everyone for joining me tonight and joining Deanna. When Deanna asked me to do a masterclass, I was wondering what I would talk about, and it only took me a few minutes to think about what I would talk about, which is attachment, which is something I feel quite passionate about, and which I think is actually at the core of every situation, every condition that I treat. And so I thought it might be good to share what I know with you, and perhaps you can get as excited about the topic as I am. So I hope is this going to work? Hang on, it's not going to. Next, here we go. I was hoping, here we go. So this is what I'm going to be talking about today. I'm going to describe what the difference is between attachment and a temperament, because sometimes they seem to be intertwined. People think that they're the same thing, or they're very much connected to each other, and they're not. I'll talk about John Balby, who is what considered to be the father of attachment, or the founder of attachment. And the two Marys refers to his Mary Answorth and Mary Main, who extended his research on attachment. I'll describe the attachment styles. There's 1 secure and 3 insecure attachment styles. I'll describe the latest research on childhood maltreatment in Australia, which is directly related to attachment. And I'll just talk about a paper that was published just in May online. I'll describe the 4 S's of showing up. So showing up as a parent, there's ways to show up as a parent that promotes secure attachment. And these 4 S's, feeling safe, being seen, being soothed, and feeling secure, you could actually apply that template to any relationship, whether it was a parent-child relationship, an intimate partner, a friend, a family member, a colleague. The same template applies to all relationships in promoting secure functioning. I'll then show you how you can find out what your predominant attachment style is, and then I'll describe some resources that you can go and look at to help you to thrive in all your relationships and in life. So the first thing we're going to talk about is attachment and temperament. So attachment refers to the emotional bond that forms between the infant and the primary caregiver or givers in the first 18 months to 24 months of life. The primary caregiver usually being the mother, but not always. Can be the father, it's either or, but it's usually the mother. And it predicts how a person regulates their emotions, especially under threat. And it also predicts adjustment and functioning throughout childhood and life. So attachment is a style. It's a behavioral adaptation, so you can change it. It's not hardwired. Temperament is hardwired. Temperament's what we're born with. It's a natural inborn predisposition, and it shows how we react to situations and handle stress. There are 4 types of temperament, and they have very strange names: sanguine, choleric, melancholic, and phlegmatic. I have no idea who came up with these names, but basically what they mean is that the sanguine type are extroverts and social butterflies. The choleric are goal-oriented go-getters. The melancholic are your orderly introverts, and your phlegmatic are the relaxed peacemakers. So temperament is not a predictor of having a particular attachment type, whether it's secure or insecure. Genes shape our temperament. Genes don't shape attachment. And so here we meet John Balby, who was an Englishman. He was an English psychiatrist and psychoanalyst. He started off learning psychoanalysis, and then he later on went to do medicine and became a psychiatrist. His background is interesting because he was born into an upper middle class English family, 4th of 6 children. His father was a surgeon and a baronet, so he was a sir. And John and his siblings were brought up by nannies, so he had limited contact with his parents, particularly his father. And his primary caregiver was in fact his nanny, and he had his nanny with him for the first 4 years of his life. She actually left the family's employment when he was 4, and he later described being devastated by that experience. He was then sent to boarding school at age 7, which to our way of thinking is probably horrifying. His early research was looking at delinquent children, and he found that they were more likely to have prolonged separation from the primary caregiver before the age of 5. And his observational and theoretical work showed that human attachment is of fundamental importance from birth, because humans are wired for attachment and we couldn't survive without it. But we seek closeness to the protective other, not because of food, but we're looking for a secure base. And he described how important that secure base is. He also observed that attachment difficulties could be transmitted from one generation to another. And I've put 2 asterisks there because I'll mention a little bit later on the work of Dan Siegel, who's a psychiatrist in America, and who's an attachment expert. And I certainly see in my own clients, because attachment, I often raise the topic of attachment with my clients, and when they look at their own experience of being parented and then try to understand, well, why did my mum do this and my dad do that? And then we talk about, well, what were their parenting experiences like? How were their parents parented? And I often hear stories about, well, grandma was one of 11, or dad lost his mum when he was 3. And I often hear those stories, and it's very obvious why both or one of the or other of the parents might have what we'd call an insecure attachment, which you're going to become very acquainted with as I go on. John Balby's work was really quite groundbreaking, but the psychoanalysts of the time were very critical of him and his theory because they were influenced by Freud. And they used to go on about infant fantasies and missing the father, which is what I was thinking about with the eating disorder. That's classic Freudian psychoanalysis with eating disorders. So the 2 Marys, Mary Ainsworth was a colleague of John Balby, and she worked with him for 40 years at the Tavistock Institute. She was an American developmental psychologist and researcher, and she's famous for creating a behavioural experiment called the strange situation, where she was able to observe pairs of mother and child. And the strange situation was because it was in a strange place. It was not in home. She wasn't observing the mother and child in their natural home environment. She was actually observing them in a place like her office or somewhere like that. And a third person was involved, what they called a stranger. And she observed what would happen when how the mother and child interacted, and then if the mother left and then a stranger came back in, observing the child again, stranger leaves, mother comes back in. So the mother leaves twice, and Mary's observing the child, and what she observed was that different children would behave differently. And it seemed like some children were quite happy. They were pleased to see their mother when they came back in and then went back to playing with their toys. Other children were completely dismissive of their mothers and didn't even notice that they left or came back in, continued playing with the toys, and were just oblivious to the children. And then other children, again, became very clingy and distressed when mum came back into the room. And so what she had identified was that there was actually 3 different attachment styles. One was secure. Those were the children who were pleased to see mum return to the room. They reconnected, and then the child felt secure to go back and play with the toys. But then the other 2 she described as being anxious avoidant or anxious ambivalent. And the anxious avoidant ones were the ones who completely sort of ignored mum, and the anxious ambivalent were the ones who were very clingy and distressed. Later on, Mary Ainsworth had a doctoral student called Mary Main, another American psychologist, and through her experiments, behavioral experiments, she was able to identify a third type of insecure attachment, which she described as disorganized attachment. And I'm going to go on to describe all those different attachment styles in greater detail in future slides. She also developed the adult attachment interview, which is a semi-structured interview that consists of 20 questions, and it's designed to identify what type of attachment the adult had in their childhood with their primary caregiver. So when you're looking at secure and insecure attachment types, we all have features of all 4 attachment types or styles. I think of it like a bit like an operating system that we have in our interpersonal interactions, but we'll have one that usually predominates. And if you're lucky, it will be the secure type. And what tends to happen is that we will continue to recreate our early attachment experiences in later relationships. So if we had a secure attachment with our primary caregiver in childhood, we will continue to have securely functioning relationships in our later relationships growing up. They could be friendships, they could be an intimate partner, they could be a work relationship. Or if we had a more insecure type of attachment style, we will recreate those experiences in our later relationships in life. So having a predominantly insecure attachment style isn't a character flaw, though. It's just a behavioural adaptation. And because of that, and because that attachment style isn't hardwired, it's possible to change that to become more securely functioning. And you can more easily do that in a healthy relationship because so the idea is that if somebody's insecure functioning, find somebody who's secure functioning and hang around with that person, or find a partner like that, because it will definitely benefit you. But you can certainly change your functioning to become more secure just by self-education, or maybe seeing a therapist if you wanted to. But you don't need to see a therapist in order to become more secure functioning. So, and also too, with the different attachment styles, there's no gender biases. I know it's very tempting to think that all avoidant types are mostly male, or ambivalent types, which are clingy, are mostly female, but it's simply not true. So let's have a look at the secure attachment style. And you can see in the photo with the mother and the baby, that mother is attuned to her child's emotional needs, and she is mirroring the expression on the child's face. She's responding to the primary caregiver who promotes a secure attachment is consistently attuned to the child and giving that child what they need emotionally and physically. So that child receives the 4 S's. The child it feels safe, it is safe, it feels seen, so that its emotions are seen and they feel felt emotionally. They are soothed when they're distressed, and they develop secure functioning. And so people who have a secure attachment style or secure functioning, as they grow up, they tend to have more self-agency. They are more self-directed in life. They have better emotional regulation and higher self-esteem than the insecure types. They're also perceived by others to be more likable and trustworthy and more emotionally available. And the research that's been done on teachers and students, say primary school students, is that teachers were seen to favour children who were more secure functioning, even though they didn't know that that was the case, but they seemed to respond more positively to those students. And more secure functioning people are able to form more trusting, meaningful and lasting relationships into adult life. Those people, because their emotions were seen, they learn to recognise their own emotions, and they recognise the emotions in other. So they have a greater capacity for empathy and compassion in themselves and in other people. They're comfortable with commitment, intimacy, and sharing their feelings. And having a secure attachment style predominantly is a huge protective factor against mental and physical health problems, and because the person develops much more resilience. And it's estimated that about 58% of the North American adult population has a mostly secure attachment style. So then we get on to the avoidant dismissive attachment style. It's sort of sometimes called dismissive in adults. So, but it's generally called avoidant. And these people, their primary caregiver was actually emotionally more unavailable to the child and insensitive to the child's emotional needs or attempts to try and connect emotionally. The primary caregiver might have provided physical care for the child and provided a safe environment physically, but they're just not attuned to the child's emotional needs. And typically what will happen when you see that, you'll actually find that that parent had the same experience with their primary caregiver. So they're just repeating what they knew. And so what happens in these people is that infant copes, their attachment system, we have attachment systems, and it copes by disconnecting both physically and emotionally. And so that child basically learns that, not to be needy. They learn to play alone. They learn to be undemonstrative. They suppress their emotions. They're actually rewarded for being quiet and not a pest. They are, told what a good child they are for being quiet and just not being a bother. And they also get rewarded in school for not being a bother. They just don't get noticed. They might get noticed for doing things. They might be top of the class, something like that. They get noticed for like they become human doings rather than human beings, and that's what they get rewarded for. And these people, as adults, become quite self-sufficient. They prefer their own company. They're quite emotionally guarded, and they can actually oftentimes have quite low libido because of the emotional suppression that comes with this attachment style. And they have extreme discomfort in expressing needs or asking for help in relationships, so that they actually don't. However, they can be quite socially gregarious. So they can be the extrovert, they can be the sanguine kind of temperament, but these people won't invite you into their personal spaces, and you'd be very lucky to get to share their bed. They might marry, but they'll always be a little bit disconnected. They'll be wearing their headphones, they'll be at work, they'll be doing other things that's a little bit disconnected from their partner or their children. Or, and they don't seek emotional comfort from others, and they're not able to comfort other people because they just don't see what needs to be done. They don't read people very well, and they often distance themselves from others, not because they think that other people will be disappointed by them. It's because they think that others will disappoint them, which sounds a bit odd, but that's what happens. And also too, the avoidant attachment style is more often seen in men with erectile dysfunction, and that came out of a study out of Spain. I estimated to be about 23% of the North American adult population, and that's the most common of the insecure attachment types. Then we get to the insecure ambivalent type of attachment style, and this stems from inconsistent caregiving of the on-again, off-again type, so that the parent again is not attuned to the infant's needs, but when they're on, they're quite intrusive in their interactions with their child. So the child learns that they may or may not get the attention that they need, and the child feels desperate for connection, and they have this disabling fear of losing it, which carries over into their adult relationships. And as adults, they can become quite clingy and needy and not trusting their partners. And interestingly, this comment here about they ignore their own needs and smother others with their unrealistic demands and expectations. Recently, I've had a few clients who've been telling me about their supervisors at work who do exactly this. And I thought, oh yeah, I know what's going on there. And these people also too, they have great concern that their loved one's going to abandon them, and they're constantly seeking reassurance that the relationship is safe and that it's on firm ground, and they'll often complain and criticize as a signal cry. And these people with this predominantly anxious, ambivalent attachment style, you can give them compliments, you can say nice things to them, but they'll always reject them and they'll rebuff them because they don't believe it, because they're sort of expecting to be abandoned. And this group have an increased probability for later anxiety disorders. It's estimated that about 19% of North American adults have this type of insecure attachment. And so when we get on to looking at the health implications for having insecure attachment styles. So we saw before that secure attachment style is protective, and it's protective for physical and mental health. But its insecure attachment style can influence our biological responses and predict stress and predict health outcomes in adults. And it's associated with distinctive cardiovascular responses to stress and shows poorer disease outcomes and lower quality of life. The anxiously ambivalent people have really exaggerated cortisol reactivity. And interestingly, the avoidant ones tend to have low cortisol reactivity, except when they're having conflict discussions, and then their sort of cortisol goes through the roof, so they avoid them. And these people also, the avoidantly attached, if they get close to somebody emotionally, it sort of can be a bit overwhelming, so they will withdraw. So they get close and then they ghost, and you often see that presentation in somebody who's very avoidantly attached. Then we get on to the disorganized attachment style. This is the most complex of the three different insecure attachment styles, and it comes from having early life trauma. That child has been brought up in a tumultuous childhood with trauma, fear, abuse, and chaos. And the child has a problem not only because they're physically unsafe and the environment's threatening, but their primary caregiver, the relationship is incoherent and it's erratic. And so there's two brain circuits that are activated simultaneously. So the child is wanting to approach the primary caregiver for protection, but the primary caregiver could actually be the source of fear. So then they've got to avoid, so they don't know what to do. And so what happens is that the infant's capacity for organized response completely collapses. And in adults, this kind of attachment style, these people are seen to act irrationally, unpredictably, and more intensely in relationships. And this attachment style has a mixture of both avoidant and ambivalent insecure attachment styles, but they've got their survival defenses on 24/7. So they misread people, they misread situations. And you see, I would think, I worked in early in my career. My first job as a psychologist was working in a medium security male prison, and I worked there for 20 months, which was a real eye-opener. And I think, if we assessed all of the attachment styles, the predominant attachment styles for all the inmates that I saw at that time, I would think that the disorganized type would have been absolutely the one that was most frequently seen, because particularly in the inmates who were there because of violent crimes. And when I interviewed them, because I had to write lots of reports for them when they were having their sentences reviewed, and for serious offenders committee and parole board and what have you, and I got to interview them and write these huge reports. I found out that they would be violent towards people because they misread people, they misread situations, they thought that they were being threatened when in fact they weren't. And they were they attacked people. And I wonder whether, when we hear about domestic violence, does the perpetrator have a disorganized attachment style, and they're misreading situations? So these people have huge difficulties regulating their emotions, and this attachment style is the strongest predictor for pathological outcomes. And you can predict later dissociative symptoms up to age 26 and borderline personality features up to age 28 with this attachment style. So this is a really difficult one. Let's talk about a paper that was published just last month by JAMA Psychiatry, JAMA being the Journal of the American Medical Association. And this was published online on the 8th of May. And it's an Australian study, and it comes out of the University of Sydney. It's a meta-analysis of 34 studies, over 54,000 participants. And what they found was that before the age of 18, they were looking at childhood maltreatment, and that included physical, sexual, and or emotional abuse, emotional and or physical neglect, and also witnessing violence. So if the participant had experienced any of those indicators of childhood maltreatment, and what they found was that this experience before the age of 18 accounted for 21% of depression and 41% of suicide attempts, or it showed nearly a quarter of depressive anxiety and substance disorders, or 1.1 million cases could be prevented if exposure to childhood maltreatment was eradicated. I found another study that was published just last year by a group from QT, Queensland University of Technology, which is where I've done 3 degrees. That group, they looked at a representative sample of 8,500 participants, and they found that 62% had experienced childhood maltreatment of the type that I just described. That's horrifying. Let's talk about some solutions and also explain some things that are going on in the brain. I'm going to introduce you to Dan Siegel. Dan Siegel is a psychiatrist. He's an author of multiple books. He's a professor of medicine at UCLA, and he's an expert on neurobiology of attachment. I had the very good fortune of doing a workshop with Dan Siegel about 18 years ago, I think. I can't quite remember, but I think it was about then. And he's a wonderful educator, but he said something that really stayed with me. And he said the therapist's role is to help their clients make sense of their lives. That stayed with me. And virtually all of my clients in their first session, I tell them that's what my job is. And so once I can make sense of their lives, I can then help them to make sense of their lives. Then they can get in the driver's seat of their life and start making some better life choices and better decisions, and start changing how they feel and think and how they perceive themselves. Dan also says how we make sense of life experiences determines the adult state of mind with respect to attachment. Basically, that's what he's saying. And so the therapist can help the person to do that. Another one of his famous statements is that how you make sense of your own life is the best predictor of your child's attachment to you, and making sense of your own experience of parenting mediates the style of parenting bond you will have with your own child. And this is stuff that I speak about with my clients. And when they're trying to understand, like I said to you before, understanding how they're functioning and why they are the way they are, and then looking at their relationships with their parents and then their grandparents and their great-grandparents, and they start to connect the dots. And you can see the attachments, some of the attachment styles, like the insecure attachment styles, going through the generations. But you can actually stop it by understanding it and making some sense of it. So as I said before, Dan Siegel is an expert in the neurobiology of attachment. So brain science, two hemispheres, right and left, and they're responsible for a lot of things, but they're responsible for differences in emotional processing and remembering experiences. And people who are insecure, ambivalent, dominantly, they tend to have like right hemisphere dominance. So they're acutely aware of their own emotions, but also acutely aware of other people's emotions. They're always reading other people's emotions. They can get flooded by emotions because they've got all this excess input from the subcortical areas of the brain. People who are more insecurely, avoidantly attached are left hemisphere dominant. So they tend to be cut off from their feelings, and they're not very good at reading other people's feelings, not very good at reading nonverbal signals. So they're logical and linear in their thinking, and they've got this this rigid self-narrative. And it reminds me of a client I saw recently who only saw me once because I think he was avoidantly attached and he couldn't do the therapy thing. But I did ask him in the interview, what's your relationship like with your wife, which is your classic therapist question. And his response was, we have date nights. That is an absolutely classic response from an avoidantly attached person, mostly avoidantly attached, because he gave me a factual answer. He was logical, he was linear, he was rigid. We have date nights. He didn't tell me what the nature of the relationship was. He just said what they did. He could have said, oh, I put the rubbish bins out once a week. You know, what do you do for your wife? I put the rubbish bins out. It's the same thing. So Dan says lack of integration between the two hemispheres explains all forms of non-secure attachment when you look at things through this lens. Some more wisdom of Dan. So coherent self-knowledge requires integration of both hemispheric functions. So self-regulation, emotional self-regulation, and psychological flexibility emerges from integration. When we haven't got integration, we go into rigidity or chaos. And this is exactly what happens with disorganized attachment. They have impaired neural integration. So they do one or the other, rigidity or chaos. And Dan Siegel says, lack of integration of the right and left hemispheres of the brain explains the entire DSM. So the DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, we are up to its 5th iteration. It's published by the American Psychiatric Association, and it's a book about that thick. It's A4, and psychiatrists and psychologists use it in Australia, New Zealand, and North America. And we are all intimately acquainted with its contents because that's what we use. It's the diagnostic Bible. Love it or hate it, that's what we use, and we all know it very, very well. In order to be able to integrate both hemispheres, what's very, very useful is the practice of mindfulness, because it requires both hemispheres working together. And just this week, one of my older clients who's a bit savvy, we were having this very conversation about how to get, his get his hemispheres working in integration. And he went off and got onto ChatGTP and asked ChatGTP, how do I promote right hemisphere function and how do I promote left hemisphere function? And he sent me all of the pages and pages of all this wonderful information, which I'm going to share with my clients because it was fantastic. Okay, let's talk about, I'm just looking at another handout that Dan Siegel created, and it's from his book, The Power of Showing Up. And this is a recent publication of his, and he, in the book, he talks about previously I talked about the 4 S's, and the 4 S's are required. Remember, it was safe, secure, soothed, and safe, seen, soothed, and secure. In order to have a secure bond with the parent needs to respond to the child's needs by providing those 4 S's. And I think the same applies to adult relationships. For safety, the parent has 2 primary jobs. They've got to keep their kids safe, but their child has got to feel safe as well. You could apply that to adults as well. If you think about a work environment, you have to have safety in your work environment. You also need to feel safe from bullying, or an intimate relationship. You need to feel safe physically. You need to feel safe emotionally. Feeling seen is the child. It's a 3-step process, and it helps children to feel felt and also feel seen. And that's by attuning to the child's feelings, understanding what they are, and responding appropriately, and then soothing the child when they are in distress, so that the internal distress of the child is shifted by the interaction from the caregiver who attunes and cares for the child. So what happens then is that through the parent soothing the child learns then to soothe themselves, this inner soothing. I suspect that people who go on to have later problems with alcohol and drug abuse, I suspect missed out on the soothing part, and they have learnt to self-soothe through using substances or other things to calm themselves. And from those three S's comes the secure base. This is the secure base that John Balby talked about. And if people feel securely functioning, they can keep themselves safe, they see themselves as worthy, and they can soothe themselves. And this handout is what they called a refrigerator sheet that they created from this book, and it's on Dan Siegel's website. I've actually, Deanna, if you could please put that in the chat, and then everyone can download that. And you could, this is a really useful handout, and you can actually change the wording to have it apply to any kind of relationship. It could be with your intimate partner, it could be your friend, it could be your work colleague, it could be your friends, it could be any relationship in any setting. This framework, this template will work very, very well. So let's talk about how do you find out what your attachment style is. There's a few places that you can go online to do online quizzes, and I think probably the best one would be Diane Poole-Heller. She's got a website called Trauma Solutions, and you can do a quiz online, and what you'll end up with is a pie graph, and it will show you the percentages of all the 4 attachment styles that you have. And we're working towards having secure attachment. And she's got a couple of books. And on the left-hand side, Healing Your Attachment Wounds, that's actually an audio book, and you can get it from Audible. The Attachment for Everyone is just a little short ebook that you can purchase from her website. And then she's got a longer book, The Power of Attachment, which is that's available as an audiobook and as a paperback, and they're all really useful materials. The next thing that you can, here's Dan Siegel again. This is only a small array or a section of some of the books he's written. He's written many, many more books. He's a wonderful author. You can find his books, his audiobooks. Some of them are on Spotify Premium. You can see his interviews on YouTube. There's lots of podcast interviews on Spotify with him, and up on the right-hand corner, there's that book, The Power of Showing Up, which is excellent. Then we've got Stan Tatkin. I am a huge, huge fan of Stan Tatkin. Stan Tatkin is a psychologist in the US. He's a relationship expert, and he's written lots of books as well that you can see at the bottom. He has a wonderful conversational style, and if you can check out his audiobooks, they're excellent. The one on the left-hand side, I think everyone needs to listen to it. Your Brain on Love, The Neurobiology of Healthy Relationships, is a fantastic book, and he uses that attachment framework to describe what makes a functioning relationship and what causes problems in relationships. So you can find him again. He's got lots and lots of podcast interviews, books, audiobooks, lots of presentations on YouTube. He's done a TED Talk called Relationships Are Hard, But Why? And his work is really, really wonderful. So I highly recommend it. Then we've got Janice Webb. Her book, she's only written 2, and they are absolute gold, particularly the first one, Running on Empty, that black book with the red and white writing. This, I recommend this to most of my clients or all of my clients who I perceive to have a largely insecure attachment. And this book helps to identify and overcome the effects of childhood emotional neglect. So where that child has not been seen and not been soothed. But basically that would be all of the insecure attachment styles. And her books are excellent. That book you can actually listen to on Spotify Premium, the audiobook. So again, she's got podcast interviews, and she's also got a YouTube channel. And then I have some questions to ask you, and I'm going to leave you with some final thoughts. So the background is, given what we've learned about attachment in the talk that I've given you, and the importance and benefits of having a secure attachment with the primary caregiver, what are the long-term emotional impacts on infants who are in full-time long daycare? And next, given the limited access Australians have to treatment with psychologists due to the Medicare Better Access program only providing 10 session rebates per calendar year, how can Australians who may have complex mental health problems due to childhood maltreatment, and that's 62% of Australian adults, according to the research, hope to recover to lead happier, more purposeful lives? Okay, so what have we done today? We've learnt about attachment and how the theory developed. You've learnt about the different attachment styles and how attachment styles influence emotional regulation, impacts our relationship, and promotes health and well-being. Attachment is not hardwired, so that we can learn to become more secure functioning in all areas of our life. We've learned about the suffering that can be reduced in Australia if childhood maltreatment was treated and eliminated. You learnt about the 4 S's of showing up as a parent, as a partner, as a friend, as a colleague. And I shared with you some resources for becoming more securely attached, functioning, and happier humans. Thank you very much. I'm actually going to leave that slide up for a moment so you can note my email address, because I have all of the papers I've referred to available. If you want to email me, I will happily send you those papers. So I think I can